Well, hello again, and continuing with our studies of in the Gospel of Matthew and demonstrating how that these prophecies are nothing more than texts that were taken completely out of their original context, some of them mistranslated on purpose to change the meaning of what was originally intended by the verses. And I should add too, that although I believe it became quite apparent when we were discussing the virgin birth, that there was no miraculous birth given by a virgin was ever intended by the original text in Isaiah. Isaiah was simply saying that a young woman, and he was actually talking about his own wife, was going to conceive and have a son. Our next supposed prophecy is in the second chapter of Matthew, and this is after the Magi have come and they've informed Herod that they've been following a star and they're looking for the birthplace of this Messiah. And Herod goes out and he has all the children killed. And to protect him from doing that, they flee to Egypt. And Matthew says in verse 15 of chapter 2, and that was until the death of Herod they stayed in Egypt, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, out of Egypt I have called my son. Out of Egypt I have called my son. Well, there's two places where that is recorded in the Old Testament, but one that is specifically done by a prophet was Hosea, chapter 11, verse 1. Hosea 11, verse 1, and it says, when Israel was a child, then I loved him, and I called my son out of Egypt. So this is simply the word son being applied to the entire nation of Israel. It is not talking about Jesus Christ. It is not talking about a future Messiah. When Israel was a child, then I loved him and I called my son out of Egypt. We can also look in Exodus 4, chapter 4 of Exodus 22, and this is when Moses is having his contest with the Pharaoh to release his people. And he says that in the prior verse to this, that the Pharaoh would not let his people go. And he says, if he will not let my people go, in verse 22 of that same chapter, and thou shalt say unto Pharaoh, thus saith the Lord, Israel is my son, even my firstborn. So you see, out of this verse, Israel is considered the firstborn son of God. The nation of Israel was God's firstborn son in the scriptures. God, in other verses in Deuteronomy, speaks of being the only God that has ever gone out and chosen a people for his name. The whole idea is a bit ludicrous when you realize that God is a spirit. And we're told many places in the Bible that God is a spirit. Nonetheless, in Deuteronomy, he speaks of no other God before doing such a thing as this, as picking out a people for his name. And he considers this people as a group as simply his own son. And that is what we are told in Hosea. That is what we are told in Exodus, and for some reason Matthew now, because he has to give some credence to this fictitious character that the church has created, applies these verses, which were originally intended to mean the nation of Israel, to Jesus. Oh, it is possible from one standpoint that Jesus did come out of Egypt, not in the physical sense in which his parents brought him down there to protect him, but in the sense is that he is based on other mythological sun gods who had their birth in Egypt. There are many, many similarities between Horus and Jesus. They all both did many of the same things, taught many of the same parallels, worked many of the same miracles. It's also possible from Alexandria might be being alluded here to, that there were many Buddhists in Alexandria at the time. And it is quite possible that some of the Hebrew people that were there may have taken their scriptures and reworked them to try and make them fit into the message that was being delivered by other religions. We also know that there was a god Serapis, which, although in some places we're told was a combination of Osiris and Apis, the bull from the age of Taurus, there are many similarities that we find between Serapis and, again, Jesus Christ. Even his appearance and statues look very similar. So it's possible that this, in some strange way, might be alluding to the origin of the story of Jesus, but certainly cannot be applied to any individual who was brought to Egypt by his parents to save him from Herod's reach, and it was never intended to be so by Hosea or by the writers of the book of Exodus. The Son of God in the Old Testament is not the Messiah, it is the nation of Israel. We'll move on to the next verse in my next video, and we'll continue to go through and show you how the writer of the Gospel of Matthew has taken scriptures entirely out of context, mistranslated them, misapplied them to try and give some authentication to the story of Jesus.